that if communism could be stopped in Vietnam, then the rest of Asia would be more secure. To Australia, the threat of communism seemed very real. Robert Menzies, the Australian Prime Minister in the 1960s, expressed the opinion of many Australians in the following quote when he said, "The takeover of South Vietnam would be a direct military threat to Australia and all the countries of South and Southeast Asia. It must be seen as a thrust towards Australia." It was for this reason that Australia became involved in the Vietnam War.
In August 1964, North Vietnamese gunboats attacked American ships in the seas off North Vietnam. This attack signified the beginning of the infamous Vietnam War. However, it was not until the 29th of April 1965 that Australia became involved. It was on this day that Prime Minister Menzies announced Australia's wholehearted and absolute commitment to the war effort in Vietnam. And in May-June of that year, 800 Australian troops arrived in South Vietnam. The political aspects of Vietnam have been discussed and debated more times than it is possible to remember, but there are other aspects of this war that have never received attention. The attitudes and feelings of the men that were affected most by the war, the soldiers. What was their attitude? They were young, most of them in their early 20s, but some as young as 19, naive and patriotic. They were mostly from the working classes, and they believed it was their duty to go and fight. They knew nothing about Vietnam, but they accepted that, according to the government, fighting was a right and honourable thing to do. What they were told and what they believed was that they were going to Vietnam to contain communism in Southeast Asia to preserve freedom. Most of them didn't even know where Vietnam was. A veteran, Frank Hurst, said this: "The day we sailed for Vietnam was one of my proudest moments, and I've since spoken to blokes, and they said that they cried that day. Our chests were that far out, our shoulder blades must have been showing." Townsville had finished up adopting us, and the people were marvellous. They were lining up 5-6 deep through this main street and the Strand, and we were drawn up in our starched pressed greens and polished brass, and our weapons were absolutely brilliant. And you could comb your hair on the spit polish of our boots. We marched the full battalion, and it really was emotional. People cheering us in our pipe band, and when we got to the quay, our wives and girlfriends saying goodbye to us. I've got a photograph of my mate Johnny Needs, who was killed later on in a mine accident. He was with his wife Donna. They'd only been married a month, and 2.5 months later he was buried in the same church. Whenever I think of Anzac Day, I think of Johnny Needs, smoking his Viscount cigarette with his arms around his wife, and how final it was. The last thing, you know. The war in Vietnam affected Australia in a way no other war had. The general belief was that it shouldn't even have taken place. By the time the Australian forces were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1972, Australian society was fractured. It was involved in a fiery and bitter debate about the Australian troops' presence in Vietnam. Public riots and mass demonstrations dominated the streets, and public opinion was widely broadcasted. Why did the Vietnam War arouse such passions? For the first time in the history of Australian war involvement, the suffering, pain and anguish of both soldiers and civilians was brought into people's homes by television. The scale of the horror seemed far greater than the politicians could ever hope to justify. When Australian and American troops were finally withdrawn from Vietnam in 1972, neither nation mourned greatly over what seemed to be an inglorious defeat at the hands of the enemy. The tragedy was that the sacrifices made by the men and women who died in Vietnam were also literally wiped from the minds of the people of Australia, while the memories painfully lived on in the minds of the soldiers. The sacrifice made by our troops in Vietnam was just as honourable as those of Gallipoli, the Middle East, Singapore, Kokoda, Korea, Indonesia, and all the other theatres of war. The Anzac fought and died nobly and gallantly for our flag in all the wars it has been involved in. The Vietnam veterans, like all veterans, should be remembered for their extreme patriotism and loyalty, and not forgetting their supreme sacrifice, the greatest sacrifice that one could ever give.